Thank you so much. Is this working? Now, when I started in about 1981, that's my first game client, and his name was Tim Skelly. Now, when Tim was brought into Gottlieb, he was brought in as a hired gun, as a consultant. And in 1981, I doubt if there were very many people who weren't in Asia who had programmed so many games that had made it to market. And actually, some of these for Cinematronics were very successful. And then Gottlieb brought him to Chicago, and I met Tim. Now, Tim was a remarkable guy because he was not only a game designer, he designed all of these, he programmed all but two, so he was a programmer, and programming these things in that day with sticks and stones was not easy. And in fact, the Cinematronics system didn't even have a real processor. It had a made-up processor by a guy who made the original Space Wars. So you really had to be on the ball as a programmer. Now, the good news, you only had to move these little line segments around, but the way he did it was quite artful. Then, he was the artist. Now, in those days, with line segments, you didn't have that much to draw, but it needed to work. Now, Tim was also an artist, and while he was at Gottlieb, just before the coin-op crash, he was trying to exploit the craze, and so he did this book. This is a comic, sort of a cartoon book that he did. And anybody who knows Robotron understands that you can trick the game. If you shoot the robots and then you don't shoot the last robot and you concentrate on Mom, the programming algorithm thinks you're stupid and makes the game easy for the next couple rounds. So that's thus the title. Now I'm going to show you one example of one of his jokes. Okay. And this is the back cover. That's a picture of Tim. Now, this picture got Tim in a lot of trouble. He's lying across 3 reactors who are on the line overnight doing their burn-in before they're stuck in a box in the factory in Bensenville. And the problem was Tim was not authorized for that picture. He came in after hours with a photographer and did this somewhat seductive picture on top of the reactor machines. When management found out in that day, I mean, Gottlieb Video Pinball was owned at that time by Columbia Pictures. They were a big corporation. And they went ballistic. And they were so very paranoid, as game companies are about the intellectual property, that they basically banned him from the factory from this moment on, shortly after they found this out. And he did fulfilled the rest of his contract working out of his apartment. They set him up with the development station. Okay, so that's Tim. He was quite a daunting character in the day. And I came out of an insurance company because I wanted to work on little computers. I hated working on mainframes because it seemed like they had a 10-year backlog in people asking for programs to support their users. And literally, they were 10 years behind. And I knew you could solve half the backlog with an Apple II computer. It was crazy. So, for Tim, this is the first sound that I did. That was Reactor. It was a very odd game. And in fact, it's on the show floor. It actually was mine. I sold it to somebody. And I really liked Reactor. In fact, everybody liked Reactor. All the engineers loved Reactor. And we were very disappointed when it got tested in the arcade and just was not good. But since it was the first homegrown effort, they went ahead and made, I think, 3,000 of them. And they must have given away the last 1,000. This is the board that I was handed. I originally was not hired as a sound guy, and I did some graphics tools and stuff, but when Tim started getting in the home stretch and they started thrashing around going, well, who's going to do audio for this? And I raised my hand because prior to my jaunt at the insurance company, I had been a musician for 7 years. So I really wanted to do this. And that's the soundboard. And the topic I want to cover right now concerns this. Yes, the name of the company that made this chip is the Federal Screw Works, and it is uniquely appropriate. And that's a Votrax chip, and that's a chip that you feed numbers into, and it attempts to make phonemes, thus making speech. It was first used, this board was designed not for video, but rather, that was the Jim Weiss designed this board for this game, and this was Gottlieb's first talking pinball in response to Xenon for ballet, I believe. Susan Ciani did Xenon. They chose this chip, and the good news is because you just shoved numbers into it, it could just talk all day. It required very little memory. The bad news is how it sounded when it talked. So, when I did this game, they gave me this board, and management knew there was a speech chip on it, and so they wanted me to use the speech chip. Okay, I'm a new guy here. Whatever you want me to do, I'll do. Now, the other part that's difficult about this at that time is there were no tools. You know, the chip made phonemes, so your tool was you have a list of speech you want to make, you have a dictionary, you look up the phonemes, then you do the correspondence between English phonemes and what the Votrax chip has for phonemes, and you code manually up a string of these things, and you say, okay, talk. And it did not do a good job. It sounded very bad. If you wanted, there's your little guy, and you could run into the chamber, and these orange particles would chase you. And then if you got out before they tagged you, they would bounce around in there. And every time they hit the wall, you would get points. And as the points accumulated, you know, you've already run out of the chamber. You're over here. Your eyes are not over here. So the speech, very functionally, would be telling you every time you crossed a threshold for these bonus points, 2,000 points, 5,000 points. It's a good feature. It's not a bad idea. So I was implementing this plus doing the sounds for it, and that's what I was trying to say. And that's what I worked from, 10,000 bonus points. That's a big one, you know, 10,000. And it should have sounded like 10,000 bonus points. And I was having some difficulty. No matter what I did, that's what I got. And I would work on it all day. I spent 8 hours once coding these things up. And after the obvious doesn't work, then you start putting Z's in here and Q's and just all kinds of stuff. Obviously, it should be able to say this. I don't believe it can. It's just it had a speech impediment and could not say bonus. It would only say bogus. Ultimately, we dropped this. And the point of this story, other than humor, that's how you get that. Because after 8 hours of trying to get it to say bonus points, there was a lot of profanity. And we finally said, screw it. What if we just gave it random numbers? We don't make an attempt at making any sense at all. We just random numbers. That's what it does. It makes this great, goofy voice. Now, we had this done, and we experimented with it and tried longer and shorter, you know, 5 random numbers, 10 random numbers. We had a pitch control for the Votrax so we could try other stuff. And meanwhile, at the other part of the factory, they were playing around with this sort of Escher-like pattern on the screen and these funny characters and stuff. And it was a guy who'd never done a video game before named Warren Davis. And he's a very smart guy, and he started he got rid of all the stuff. He said, well, let's make it a pyramid. Let's not cover the screen in this tessellated pattern. Let's do that. And we liked the character, and the guy designed the character, him, so that he could fire things out of his nose. And originally the game was called, the code name for the game was Snots and Boogers. But Warren, being a new guy, wanted to keep it simple, and he didn't want to have to do all that hit detection, worrying about projectiles going across the screen and them hitting stuff and all that stuff. He just wanted to keep it much simpler. So when I saw what he was up to, and I already knew I had the voice, I said, Warren, have I got a deal for you? This is going to be fun. And it was important for the gameplay to understand. These guys would talk before they came on the screen, and they're such a pain in the ass when they come on the screen. They're always messing you up. So it was functional within the game to understand a purple guy was coming versus a green guy. And so this was, you know, a home run, and I'm very proud that I believe, you know, they sold a lot of Q*berts, 30,000 Q*berts, meaning the Federal Screwworks sold 30,000 Votrex chips, and I believe I put their chip to the finest use. That making the voices for Q*bert was its finest destiny. Anything else was a bad idea. Oh, a little more detail on this board. 1981, this was our soundboard. We had a 6502 chip running at 0.894886 megahertz. Why not 1 megahertz? Well, because the color burst crystal that you could buy these days, those days was very cheap, much cheaper than buying a legitimate 1 megahertz chip. So they bought a color burst crystal and divided it down. And so you get this lame, less than 1 megahertz clock rate. And then there are no RAM chips on this board. We just have basically a parallel port that has 128 bytes of RAM in it. And so that was my memory. And we had two 2K EEPROM chips. We were swimming in storage. And we had an 8-bit DAC. And everything else on that board is silly stuff. And you know, it supports interfacing the board to the game and the Votrex chip and other things. But really, just those 5 chips is what I spent 2 years of my career on. And the way we made sound, obviously with only 2K of, that's 4,000 bytes of 8-bit memory. That's not much. You obviously can't record things and sample them and put them on the board. Well, you could do one. You could have a game board with like 1 sound in it. So the way we made sound is we had to write algorithms. We had to write programs that put out a voltage that moved the speaker in such a way that it made the sound you want. Now, this is not straightforward. It's not like synthesis, where, I mean, I was a synthesis guy, and if you had synthesis, you'd start with a waveform, you'd apply these analog filters and envelopes over time, you could do all these things and make sounds. We couldn't do that. You couldn't implement a filter. Well, I implemented filters, but they were useless because they ate up all the processing. So you had to do this bizarre thing where you literally just move the speaker in such a way that you got what you want. So I'm going to play 4 examples that I'm particularly proud of. I always believe on any coin-op project that one of the most important sounds is to reward the participant for having put money in the game. It should be either a fanfare or something that invokes a memory of sex or something very clear. And that's an algorithm that, to me, sounds like dropping a quarter in a glass jar. I'm very proud of that. I'll do it again. Now, the next one I'm surprised I got away with, because that's the sound of coily sproinging, jumping around on the pyramid. I think it's a little fart-like, frankly. And in that time, you know, the industry was very sensitive to having a bad reception, having had Death Race 2000 and such. I got away with it. Now this is a multiple sound event. You could arbitrarily code sounds that had multiple parts going on simultaneously, but with this board you could never have more than one of those running at a time. So when Q*bert would victoriously jump off the pyramid and rise back up to the top, foiling the people chasing him, and he falls back down onto the thing. And those of you who are into audio can hear all kinds of aliasing and nasty artifacts. Those were unavoidable doing anything that was less than trivial. I just decided they were part of the sound. That was my high frequency stuff. I mostly used the sine wave, and then for the high frequency stuff that would cut through in the arcade, I used aliasing. And then the last part is where coily attacks you and gets you. And so it's kind of okay. This involves both the Votrex chip and some synthesis.
Hey, Bucky, you're right.
Again, some flatulence at the end, and I never had a problem with that. And there are only two things in Qbert which are actually coded up as phonemes, and this is one of them.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. And I think when you turn on the machine, he says, "I'm turned on." For those of you who want to dig deeper on this, I was talked into writing a chapter on how I did this by a friend. My friend is Ken Greenbaum. He's now at Apple. And Audio Anecdotes is a book which is a series of chapters written by many, many people on techniques. Some of them are very esoteric. It's an interesting book if you're interested in digital audio. And I wrote a chapter called Retro Game Sounds. And in the book, I went to the trouble of taking those 6502 routines, and in modern times, I recoded them in C and ran them and listened to them. And I was thrilled that those algorithms were robust, that my C versions of this code sounded just like the 6502. I mean, obviously they were being computed a bit faster, and I had to slow them down, but otherwise. So you can, actually this chapter at least is available just on Google Books. You can just, if you're interested, you just want to read it. I think the book may be out of print, but included in the book was a disc which had the code. So 3 of my favorite routines that made music, that made crazy stuff, and something, and explosions are described in here. So that's for those of you who want to dig deeper. Last time I talked about how much the soundboards have improved, and this time I thought, let's talk about the development system. That was my development system. Now, that was a huge improvement over what I started with. When I first started, when they gave me a soundboard, I was coding on a Rockwell Blue Box. Now, this was a processor emulator, and its main function in life was to take new boards, new designs, and be able to debug them and test them and figure out that the board was working. It wasn't really a good software tool. And because I had virtually no storage for anything, so it limited you to like 4-character labels for your routines and stuff. It was grim. That was a huge upgrade. It had a 1 megahertz 6502 and 48K of RAM, 114K floppy, and it cost, with 2 disk drives, $2,638 in the day. Now, if you adjust that for inflation, that would cost you $9,231. Yeah, isn't that amazing? In 2010, what I work on is a quad core running at 2,839 megahertz. I have 8 gigabytes of RAM. My hard drives total 1,535 gigabytes, and it cost me $1,300 because I build my own computers. Okay, that's maybe not quite fair, but I mean, if I were on a Mac, it might be twice that. Now let's compare. Let's compare and contrast the 2 development stations. The clock is a bit faster. It's 166,000 times more memory, and 13 million times more disk storage. Let's take an analogy. Now, from the Research and Innovative Technology Administration Bureau of Transportation Statistics, I got that in 1980, the fleet average for sedans, cars, was 16 miles per gallon. In 2007, which was the most recent year that they had numbers, it's 22.5. That's an improvement. Let's imagine if car mileage improved to the same degree as processor clock. And let's be fair. Anybody who has fought in the 8-bit wars understands that a 6502 running at 1 megahertz gets as much work done as a Z80 running at 4 megahertz, okay? Jerry will agree. The 6502 was the first RISC processor. So I took that number, that Intel number, that very big number that modern processors, and I divided that by 4 and recomputed the ratio. It's still interesting. So when you buy your new car, and if you have modest needs, you'd only have to put 1 gallon at the dealership, and it would run for 11,356 miles. Cool. And even more interestingly, if you take the adjusted price, you could buy a Lexus luxury sedan for $3,700. Now, why is this interesting? I am humbled because think about, if you don't work in computers, imagine if your hammer improved to this degree. Imagine if your whatever domain in which you work, you're surfing the changes, and clearly I don't work. I mean, these are my tools. I don't work 2,000 times better than I did in 1981. Not 2,000 times faster. The stuff that comes out the other end is not. Clearly, I'm doing better, I think. I'm doing more with the same amount of time. But it is humbling. Okay, so that's that part. I'm not going to talk about the past anymore. Let's talk about, and my definition of modern pinballs from my perspective. I have a 17-year gap in my pinballness from the last machine that I did for Data East, which was Monday Night Football, probably in 1987, and when I did the first one for Stern Pinball, which was in 2006. So I have a gap in my pinballness. So what do I want? This is from Tim's book. This was inspired by a real event, sort of. Sounds are vital to the success of any game. Therefore, great care must be taken to get just the right effects. The game between Reactor and Qbert was something called Protector, Guardian. It had 5 names, and it was never made. One of the things that happened in the game, you had a super character controlled by a trackball, and you would. Did you do this, or are you trying to keep the enemies? They would run into concrete buildings and knock pieces of the buildings off, crushing the pedestrians below. And your job was to try to stop them from doing that. So with my little 8-bit system, I was trying to come up with the sound of concrete falling and crushing pedestrians below. And so in the factory where we had our offices, we had a balcony that looked down into the factory. And so I had somebody down there, and I was dropping bricks. And I was trying to miss the person with the microphone. And so Tim saw that, and thus inspired this. From my point of view, pretty much all artistic endeavors are somewhat affected by constraints. If you're an oil painter and you work in oils, there's a certain expectation that you're going to paint on canvas, maybe, and certain kind of painterly techniques are going to apply. And the scale of your work, is not going to get bigger than a wall and so on. There's constraints that come from the decision to having chosen oil painting as what you do. And I've chosen, for better or worse, I've chosen to do sound for pinball games. So modern pinball games have constraints. And these aren't bad, they just are what they are. And then within those constraints, you want to be creative and you want to produce stuff that does what it was supposed to do. Entertain and amuse and inform. I'm going to talk about really 2 of the 3 major constraints. The first one is, for me, pinball audio equals pinball design. I mean, I'm a composer. I could compose anything. But the stuff that I do is functional because I always have to pay attention to what should I be saying now? What does the player need to know? How can I best say that? How can I say that? And the best way to say is probably the most entertaining way that supports the current metaphors. Now that little riff at the end will just repeat. And that message is, we are waiting for you to do something, okay? If you want to stop that loop, plunge. And this is the simplest case of message. But part of that is you haven't just started any pinball. You've started an NBA basketball pinball. So this was a delight for me to do this game because the NBA doesn't own any sound assets. I had to create everything, and I had a great time doing it. A lot of the examples I'm going to use are from this game because I did create the assets and I control them more or less. I don't want to really use assets that Stern licensed from somebody else because I really have no rights to exploit them. One of the things I really tried to do, not only is now you're in main play and there's some energy and you should be doing stuff, you should be playing, and while you're hearing this, of course, you're not hearing it because there's all kinds of things that happen. You're hitting targets and you're sitting in ejects and that kind of stuff. But every piece of main play, and there are 17 of these short loops that are all inspired by the stuff that happens in stadiums when you're in a basketball game, when you're on offense and defense, all those crazy, dum, 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 let's go, those things. There's like 19 of those. This is one of the more musical ones. And every piece of music in this entire game has crowd sound mixed into it. Now, some of the examples I showed you won't, just because I wanted to show off the music. But I never want you to leave the stadium, because part of what I'm trying to reinforce is you're in a basketball game and you're doing this stuff. Now, you don't spend very long in any of these because you're going to go into some mode. Now, fast break is a timed mode. It doesn't loop forever. Once you've started fast break, I think you have to hit the ramps as many times as possible, and you get big points for doing so. And that stuff at the end where the music drops away and it just goes into a beat, that's a message too. You're pretty much at the end of your time, and you better do as many of these as you can because this music is not going to loop forever. And hopefully it's unambiguous that that's the fast break mode, because it's coded into the tune. Clearly, a lot of the other messages correspond to hitting switches and doing things. This is a difficult one that I'm rather proud of, because it was hard to do and it worked. One of the modes that you can do by dropping drop targets, probably 2 or 3 times, 3 banks of MVP targets, starts a double scoring mode, which you obviously want to time that after you've started some multi-ball, because points rack up big time. And so what I wanted to do, it was themed MVP, most valuable player. And so what I wanted to do was have a stadium crowd chanting MVP. Now, I can't go to a television broadcast of a basketball game and when the crowd is chanting, pull that, because I don't have rights to it. Stern could get sued by NBC or TNT or whoever is broadcasting that game. There's this broadcast is used only by such a, I can't do that. This is a commercial enterprise. So I need to come up with this. Now, it's very difficult. There are some sounds, I can make a lot of sounds, and I have huge libraries of all kinds of stuff, but I don't have a crowd saying MVP. Yes, I do. Okay, and the way I did this, it's worth sharing the technology. What we have on the left is some crowd noise. What we have in the middle is a little synthesizer. It's a program, really. It's a soft synthesizer. 10 years ago, it would have been a box. Now it's just something that runs in the computer. It's called a vocorder. Now, people have been vocording for 50 years. The principle is you take a sound and you change it by another sound. and you change its frequency, content, and its pitch. You modify it. So you can look at the one on the left as the carrier. That's the one that's going to be modified. And then the one on the right is the one that's going to modify it.
MVP!
MVP, it's me. So let's do that again.
MVP!
So you put those two signals, you let vocoder put those two signals together, and it's not like a permission to let it do it. You have to set a lot of knobs, and it takes a little bit of finesse too. And it works. You know, I was like thrilled. I had no idea that it would. I said, well, let's see, what if we vocorded it? Maybe I could do it, because otherwise I was going to have to do something else. The other reason why pinball audio is what it is the metaphor. I mean, obviously you would hope that a game based on a space game would sound different than Lord of the Rings. I look for signature sounds. Within a metaphor, like Iron Man, I look for a signature sound that, you know, you hear that and you go, Iron Man. And one of his major signature sounds is the repulsor. So that thing in his hand, which is both used for navigation and for blowing stuff up, that's the repulsor. And actually, I had to resynthesize it, because though we were allowed to use sound effects from the movie, there was never a clean one. And I also wanted like 5 different variations of it. So I resynthesized this from pieces. And that was on the targets on the left that spell iron and the targets on the right that spell man. Now, I have seen comments in the forums as to why these are not labeled. Why doesn't that say iron? And on the other side, why doesn't that say man? Well, that's the licensee. That never happens in Iron Man world. Iron and man are never to be separated. Okay? So, if in the pinball game, if you had a bank of 7 targets, you could have labeled them Iron Man. But you can't, the licensee would not allow Iron Man. The Iron Man pinball is based on movie 1 and movie 2, and while we were working on it, movie 2 was not out. So we had limited assets to draw upon for movie 2. So I had to make, you know, Whiplash's Whip, the stuff they had in the trailer, which we were allowed to use. When they add the sounds to a 120-second trailer for a modern movie, the movie's never done, obviously, because they're promoting something that's coming out 3 months from now. So the company, which is a completely different company than the company making the film, who's making this thing to get you interested in the thing company B is actually making, the pictures are usually right, but the sound never is. So the whip that's in the trailer is not really the sound that Whiplash makes, so I made my own. You know, it's obviously an electric whip. It's a pretty good electric whip. You would not want to be hit by this whip. As an exercise, I was curious myself, and I thought it was a good way to show metaphor. Every pinball game that I've worked on, and probably am likely to work on, will have the slingshot. You know what? Everybody knows what I mean by a slingshot. Those angled things that cause the ball to go sideways and drain. Okay. And, but within the metaphor, I mean, that's a really abstract concept. What does a slingshot mean to a pirate? How does that fit into the pirate world? What does a slingshot mean for Wheel of Fortune? Well, these are the answers that I've come up with for 7 games, and I'm just going to play them all next to each other. I found it fascinating, probably more than you will, but... Yes! A basketball, of course. Now, if you've seen Iron Man 1, when the bad guys in the caves in Gulmira, when they've decided they've uncorked the genie and found a hideous monster who's trying to chase them, he's gotten his first primitive suit going, they shut a metal door and try to keep him inside. He starts banging on the metal door to get out. That's that sound. It's just great sound. So that's a sound from the movie. And Indiana Jones is an obvious one. I thought that a whip was very good sound for a slingshot. Family Guy is a cartoon sound, which kind of befits the silly nature of Family Guy. Spider-Man's kind of one of those whoosh sounds, like when he's webbing out and stuff. Basketball off the slingshot, I think, is a reasonable thing to do. I punted on the other ones. I mean, you got to have something there. But I'm not like really proud of my slingshot sound from Pirates of the Caribbean. I couldn't come up with hit the slingshot and they go arr. I think we get tired of that. Okay, now another constraint, I think the most important constraint for modern pinballs, all of which are based on licenses, are the rules of engagement. What you are allowed to do and not allowed to do across the three categories of assets that you may or may not get from the licensees. The key thing to know, when people ask me this, they're never the same. They tell me, what do you normally get to do? You normally never know. That's what normal is. They're never the same. An example. For sound effects in Pirates of the Caribbean, nothing. For Iron Man, on the other hand, yes. And wonderfully, liberally, they gave us, this is a term that 2 years ago I was unfamiliar with. Before I did Spider-Man 3 years ago, I didn't know what a sound effects or what a sound stem was. And so I'll tell you so I can use the word for the rest of the presentation. Stems are a submix of the soundtrack of a movie. By category, right? Movies have three classes of assets in a movie. Speaking, dialogue. So there's a sound effect, there's a dialogue stem, and then the sound effects, the things that aren't music, that aren't dialogue, everything else, that's the sound effects stem. And then there's the music stem. And when they're in post-production trying to assemble all these elements into something that runs across the movie, they build these stems separately. So it's possible for a licensee to give you the sound effects in isolation, which is the best thing for cutting them up. And we got those from Iron Man production company, and I extracted as raw material 756 discrete sounds from Iron Man 1. Now, I'm not saying those are in the game. They're not. But I gave them to Lyman and Lonnie. They had them. And the trick there, it took like almost 2 weeks to do, because it's not hard to cut them out, but it's hard to figure out what they are. So you have to have them synced with the movie. And you hear something you like, and then you go, but what is this? And when you use it in the game, you might not use it the same way as it was in the movie, but because it was just a cool sound. In any case, so in the rules of engagement, huge win on Iron Man, not so big a win on Pirates of the Caribbean. Musical licensing, the first two things are mechanical rights and performance rights. And I'll explain mechanical rights like this. This is what we got for Family Guy. That's a mechanical right. I typically don't get sheet music, but I get the rights to use those notes, that theme. That's it. I don't get to take stuff from the show and play it back. I just get to do that. It was kind of fun because in Family Guy, I used that theme in about 6 different ways, and I have 4 examples of that. Now, I'm trying to exploit the license. I want to do music like they do music, and I tried, but the Family Guy theme is very tuneful. It's an earwig, and if you just played the theme straight out, you'd get sick of it really fast. So I go to halftime, I play a little of it, then I do something, then I play a little more of it. I kind of stretch it out over time so it's a little more palatable and not quite so dense. Then Pat Lawler, who did this game, went to a street show in his neighborhood and saw a Zydeco band. So he made a personal request for a Zydeco version of the theme. He asked for it, and we put it on Fart Multiball, one of my proud moments. Stewie had his own, if you're not familiar with the game, has his own little miniature playfield, and if you know the show, Stewie is a demented little undefined toddler who is striving for world domination. So his version of the theme is a little demented, all played in minor seconds. In one of the episodes, they did a viewers suggested situations they'd like to see the Griffins get into, and one of them was they all got superpowers. So Peter got the ability to transform things, and Meg, his daughter, got the ability to grow her fingernails really fast. And so I got to write a heroic version of the theme. Okay, the other right is performance right. Now, performance right just means you take a recording of the thing the licensor has and you digitize it and you stick it in the game. We did that with Indiana Jones. And it's a huge win, I mean, in terms of getting all attached to it, because John Williams writes this incredibly memorable, heroic thing. Now, I'm going to play, the problem it gave to me was that's only good for main play. What about the other 9 modes in the game? So I tried to write in John Williams' style, orchestrally, and this is the Last Crusade stuff, where this is all about Germans and pre-war Nazi Germany and so on. Okay. CSI, I'm not going to play anything from it. I'm staying away from playing other people's assets. I'm really just playing things that I wrote mostly. In CSI, this was the most liberal thing that we've encountered, where they said you can use any music from any of the 100 shows. And I had them all on a hard disk. And the interesting thing, unique kind of to CSI, is they have 3 montages per show. Now, by that I mean, in the show, if you've ever seen it, something happens and they go to the lab. And they go to the lab and they start hanging around all this very cool high-tech equipment, and they start poking buttons and looking at things. And during the montage, there's only music. There's no dialogue, there are no sound effects, it's just music. And there's 3 of those per show. And they're all, different every show. So do the math. I had 300 loops of music to choose from, and I picked 60, and I think 20 or more ended up in the game, which is more loops than would typically end up in a pinball. Now, I want to say about Iron Man, I owe this guy, and you say this, Ramin Djawadi, is an Iranian, German-born Iranian kid who works in Hollywood. This was his first big action film, and he wrote this great music for it. Now, initially, I was kind of against paying money to get it, because it just didn't seem to be that memorable. It's not like you would hear it. If we put it in the game, you wouldn't go, Iron Man. I didn't think at the time. But I was wrong on 2 accounts. One is I was just judging that from having seen the movie. His music was so intense, so rocky, so powerful that in the movie it's kind of mixed down. It's wildly overlaid by dialogue and sound effects. So you really can't get the full intensity of it. And John Borghi pointed me at YouTube to a bunch of these still pictures that had the Iron Man soundtrack, and I became a fan after a while. The other thing is his stuff is a lot rockier and a lot more intense than most music for action movies, if you can believe that. And so we licensed 5 tracks from the soundtrack. It was cut up into 14 different loops for the game. And I won't play his stuff because it's his. But we had nothing for Whiplash because that's the second movie, and we had no access to anything from the second movie. So I got to do this. And like all the tunes, not all the tunes I write, but I like to write a tune that you can sing along with. So you can sing along Whiplash, you can do that. For the next one, you can also sing War Machine. I want everyone to sing along. Ready? Almost. So the last rule of engagement is for speech. And people, it always disappoints me when I go out to the forums and I've just done a job and I've really worked hard and the last 4 or 5 or 6 months of my life have been spent creating this soundtrack for a game. And I go out there and I look at the forums. There wasn't enough Jack, Captain Jack. There wasn't enough Robert Downey Jr. It never talks about the things I spend all my time on. The people who write to the forum seem to be very focused on the speech. How was it talking to us? Okay, I can dig that. So how the speech ends up in the game is governed by these rules of engagement. Now, an example. There were nothing from Pirates of the Caribbean could be cut out of the movies. It's Disney. NBA, there's a different reason, because they don't own any assets. The TV companies who produce basketball games have audio assets, but our deal's with the NBA, so they have no audio whatsoever. So we got nothing from them. On the other hand, if yes, where do you get your stuff? What's the quality? How much can you cut out cleanly? You get TV stereo audio, that was Family Guy, Wheel of Fortune, and CSI. From the DVD, Indiana Jones, that's what we did, and their trailer for Iron Man 2. Second best really is Spider-Man and Iron Man 1. You get the dialogue stem, which is all the dialogue separated from everything else. So you can just cut and go nuts. And then the last one, some of these guys won't give you the stems. They don't want to let your they just don't trust you with their assets. So you can go through the movie and say at 3 minutes, 20 seconds, we like when they say that. Will you give that to us? So, and that one you don't get as much stuff because it costs money to have them cut stuff up. Then, that's the stuff from the licensor. Obviously, you need some custom speech because it's unlikely that Captain Jack said anything about multi-ball. So, who are you going to get? The star, of course. That's what you want. You want Johnny Depp, and you want, my mind's failing me, for the stars of major pictures that I've worked on. But that's who you want. Now, the problem is they're expensive, if available at all. And they also have it written into their contract, right of first refusal. So, they can demand that you either pay them or you don't get that character at all. Now, in several of our games, we have gotten the star. We got Pat Sajak and Charlie O'Donnell, who's the announcer for Wheel of Fortune. And they were great. It was the gnarliest, ugliest, biggest script I've ever seen because it had all that concatenation to talk about puzzles and numbers and letters. And Pat Sajak was a real trooper.
This game is brought to you by Stern Pinball.
I feel like I'm in a pinball machine.
Custom speech. Now, it's ironic that we got this other one. This is the Grand Slam, creme de la creme. This is as good as it's gotten, at least in the 8 games I've worked on. And I can't imagine it really getting any better than this. And it's ironic because this guy is the highest paid producer-writer in Hollywood. His annual salary now is just phenomenal. Obviously, he doesn't need the money. He just was a nice guy. So I would like to acknowledge that and say this was as good as it gets.
You take care of that extra ball.
You might want to clean off that ball now.
When you're done pretending, put money in.
Basically, you should look at my map is the main bullet point of this presentation.
Part 4 in our exclusive story, Man Fights Chicken.
Unleash the silver orbs.
Seth MacFarlane. Can we have a hand for Seth MacFarlane? It was a Saturday around the holidays, and he had a Family Guy Christmas party to go to, and the last thing he wanted to do, given what he does every day, was to show up in his Family Guy studio and look at this crazy 600-line script for this pinball crap that, But he did it, and he was a trooper, and 90 minutes in and out, he just nailed it. He's a very intelligent guy. Okay, if you can't get the stars, you can get sound-alikes. And the deal with sound-alikes, typically, most assets want to protect the quality of their license, so they'll typically say, you have to use our sound-alike. You're going to have to pay them whatever. And Disney, this is what we did with Disney, and it was a great sound-alike. In fact, I think this guy sounds more like Captain Jack than Johnny Depp. You'd be the judge.
Let's call us what we really are. Pirates. Very good pirates. Aim for the heart. It's still alive!
He's great. No problem. Now, for Iron Man, I believe that Robert Downey Jr. was like burnt to a crisp because I think he did the voices for the Iron Man video game on Sega, like Xbox 360. So what we got instead is we got a Jarvis sound-alike. And he's good, but he's such a good voice talent, we also had him do 4 other voices in the game.
You have accumulated a great number of points on this ball.
Look, it just went supersonic.
Be careful, or you will tilt, sir.
War machine completed.
So he was very, very good, and the studio, he's the guy when you make a licensed product on Iron Man who will do your Jarvis for you. Now, there's no assets. NBA has no assets, so we got to create out of, and we hired a guy who's done this before. In fact, he did the Bally Midway NBA game, and he did ours, and he's a very talented guy.
Welcome to NBA Pinball. A lot's riding on the outcome of tonight's game for both teams. Two-handed reverse jam off the beautiful alley-oop pass. Oh, that was a monster dunk.
And, that's just rewarding. You just made a ramp shot. Okay, and the last thing I'm going to say is just a little commentary. There's nothing less rewarding for a sound guy, and I discovered this in 1981. I went to my first video show where we had Reactor or whatever, and you go to these places where there's a whole lot of games. It's kind of like it's a trade show, or if you go to an arcade, or if you go out into either of those rooms, primarily the pinball room, there's nothing less rewarding for the sound guy because I can never hear the games. I have no idea what's going on, and I coded them. I stood out at the Iron Man. I was like, let's see, which sounds survived? About 5 of them. So I want to make the argument and suggest a couple things you might do, because the games are, in my experience, more fun if you can hear your game. Why you should care. This is my Hall of Fame. These are the guys who have worked very hard to provide sound for solid-state pinball machines since 1980 or about that time, once started getting sound systems that were worthy of attention. Last year, in this spot, speaking, was Brian Schmidt, and he's done about 45 games. Chris Granner, who retired, and I took his place, he's done a whole bunch too. Now, actually, I want to point out, I have a question mark next to Craig. Craig worked at Gottlieb and Premiere. Now, I derived all these numbers from IMDb, or the Internet Pinball Database, okay? And it turns out, it looks like half or 3/4 of all games ever made by Gottlieb and Premiere have no attribution whatsoever for who did the audio. Talk about being ignored. So poor Craig, I think he's number one. I'll bet you he's done like 50 games. But I couldn't tell you for sure, so I just made up a number 30. I found like 17, but I knew he'd done a boatload more than that. And, you know, I like to think it's quality over quantity, but what can I say? And then the other two guys who are working for, we're all consultants working now for modern Stern Pinball. Jeff Powell did the conversion of Family Guy into Shrek, and Ken Hale did Batman, Big Buck Hunter, and 24. Those are the three of the modern pins that I haven't done. So these guys have committed enormous parts of their professional careers at trying to make you happy. So it's better if you could hear what they're doing. In 1989, I worked for a company called Incredible Technologies. They did Golden Tee Golf and a few other things. And I was a manager there, besides doing sound. And so I pushed through this project. And it was called, all our projects were something, Romit, something. And this was called Hear It. And it was a kit, an aftermarket kit. You could take any arcade game, drill a 1-inch hole. We had a hardened metal plate that contained an 1/8-inch stereo jack and a volume control, flush mounted so that no physical abuse could nail it. You can always stick gum in the hole. Okay. It's easier to destroy than it is to create. But it was just an idea before its time because people didn't have that many headphones. You know, it's a crazy idea in 1989. Who would be walking around with headphones? Okay, so here its time is now. And it would be great if all games were retrofitted with an 1/8-inch audio jack. You could plug it, you could go anywhere out there on the floor, plug your Walkman headphones, your whatever, your Bluetooth adapter, and hear your game while you're playing. Isn't this a good idea? So it's in the public domain now, go nuts. For those of you who have large collections of games, large being defined by more than 2, you have a game room with, 8 games, 12 games, 15 games. Here's my suggestion. Organize the games into, number the games from 1 to 12. Move your games around so the games whose sound you like are in the even slots, and then all the odd numbers, turn the sounds way down. Now all the even ones, turn them up. Because the way sound works is with distance. If I'm playing this game and this game's making no sound and this game over here is making sound, me and the person playing this game have a chance of hearing their game because there's no interference from this game or this game, the one right next to me. Just an idea. Just thought I'd spitball that and throw it out. Oh, and the other thing, this goes back to just a heartbreak. You work so hard on this stuff and you go to an arcade and there's some arcade owner who's got a tremendous large speaker like our PA blaring down music into the room. It's just like, fine. It's so frustrating because there is no volume button for art. You can't turn the art down on these things. You can't turn down gameplay. But why there's a volume control? I'm just at the end now, and I want to thank, I took pictures from Pinball News and IPDB. I want to thank Stern Pinball in case they ever see this, because I'm going to stream this on YouTube, and thank them for permission, which they gave me to do this. I want to thank Jerry, who's here, for inviting me to speak, and Mike, who 2008 created a terrific video out of that talk, which I have yet to stick on the internet, but I will. And I want to thank my wife, who will probably see a video of this, because she does make this possible, because she feeds me and does stuff like that. Last thing, my company, which is just me and my wife, is Odd4Int, which stands for Audio for Interaction. And I don't care. I'm not proud. We'll work on anything if you'll pay me. And I have samples of my work, videos of all of the Stern Pinballs at that address. And if you don't want to write it down, I have cards. If you're curious, they're 4 minutes long, and you'll get to hear stuff you don't hear even if you own the machine, because there's all those sound effects on top of it. And if you want to contact me for some reason because you missed some of that, or just because you're curious, or if you have a job which you want to pay me, I'm there. Those are the games. Thank you so much.